Bruchim Abayim b'Shem Hashem. B'Shem Yigin Terem Moses Boston. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's drasha from Rabbi Uri Deutsch Shlita. We'd like to give a big yeshikar to the sponsors of tonight's shir, Rabbi Moshe Kleinley, Nishmas Imoy, Risha Edel, Basar Avrom Ever, Sholom, Yotzat Aleph Rishchedish Elul. I'd like to give a yeshikar to Rabbi Levi Hachaizer for sponsoring tonight's shir, Lili Nishmas, Menachem Av Yaakov, Ben Meir, Zotzal Pam, Yotzat Menachem Av, and Lili Nishmas Av, Rabbi Moshe, Ben Levi, Yotzat also Menachem Av, Tenish Besem Turis, the Torah Chaim. To have the great schools of sponsoring a shir or to help you mechazek Irgun Shuri Torah by putting an ad in the dinner journal for Irgun Shuri Torah's upcoming annual dinner next Monday night, and be mechazek the worldwide Abbasas Torah of Irgun Shuri Torah throughout the year. Call 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Tonight, for the first time, we have the schus to have with us a Rabbi Uri Deutsch Shlita, Rav Forest Park, Lakewood, came to mechazik us, and everyone who's been mishtatev through the phone, all the many people mishtatev from watching the shir now and later on the Nisyanis Achaim, understanding Hashem's ways. It's my covet to call on Rav Deutsch for tonight's rush.
It's hard to imagine a better time to try and gain an understanding of Hashgachasa Yisbarach than this period of the Shiva de Nechemta. We end Megillas Eicha with the words Ki im mo'is mo'astonu kotzafta oleinu ad me'oid. And that's actually where Megillas Eicha ends. Our minig is to then say again the preceding pasuk, Hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'noshuva chadeshumenu kikedem, as Rashi says in the end of Megillas Eicha, Pnei shemesayim b'divrei teichacha, because the Megillah ends with words of admonishment, Ki imois ma'astonu katzafta oleinu hutzrach lichpoil mikro shelefanov. So therefore we repeat again the preceding pasuk. But in fact, Megillas Eicha concludes with, as Rashi describes it, divrei teichacha. And Rashi explains that pasuk of Ki imois ma'astonu bishvil shechotonu. Despite the fact that we acknowledge, Klal Yisrael says, as the Navi expresses it on behalf of Klal Yisrael, even though shechotonu, even though we've strayed, lo hoyu l'chol harbois ketzef ad me'oid. You, Kiviyachol Rebbeinu Shalom, shouldn't have multiplied what appears to us as your anger ad me'oid. Kotzafta oleinu ad me'oid. What does the expression ad ma'oid mean? Until a lot. What's the difference between using the expression harbe and using the expression ma'oid? What's the difference between harbe, which implies much, and ma'oid, which is a lot? What's exactly the difference in Lashon Kodesh between the two? And the way it's explained in the Rishonim is that the word harbe refers to a measurable quantity that's in front of us. So we could be accustomed to have, for example, a certain amount would be the usual amount we expect of something, and harbe would be more than that. Harbu alai moyaru maton. There's a certain accepted amount of moyer maton, harabu, present more. When we use the term ma'oid, what we're implying is that the ribui, the multiplicity, the increase, goes beyond what's actually present. Ma'oid means beyond what we can immediately measure, or beyond what we can immediately conceive of or understand. So therefore we can have the expression harbe me'oid, even together. Because harbe means what's in front of us has been multiplied to a larger than expected quantity, and ma'oid means it then goes further. For example, momoin, money, is called ma'oid, b'chol me'oidecha, as we say in Krishma. Why is it that money is called ma'oid? Because the value of money is in terms of what it can generate in profit. So it contains in it a larger quantity than itself, beyond what's actually present. Ma'oid. So when we say ki im mois mo'astanu kotsafta oleinu ad ma'oid, it means that the churban and what Klal Yisrael endured didn't end at the point of the churban. Kotsafta oleinu ad ma'oid means churban left its mark for generations, for millennia. And therefore Rashi says, Lo hoy l'chol harbois ketzef ad ma'oid kasher kotzafta. What defines Golus, and specifically the Golus of Bayis Sheni, as the Ramban points out towards the end of Parshas Kisovoi, is that what actually defines the Golus that we're in is that it doesn't have what's called the Kates Megule. We don't have a clear sense of when the Golus is going to end. Golus of Bayis Rishon, the Ramban says, as represented by the Teichachim Parshas B'chukoisai, has a clear Kates of Shivim Shanas. The Gemara describes at length in Masechta Megillah the various calculations that were made by various Malchei Umas Olam to know when that Golus will end. But the ultimate Golus, the Golus which will be the precursor to Geula HaSidah, to Bias Mashiach, is a Golus without an end. Like the Ramban points out, Parshas Kisovoi doesn't end with a Kates. Kotsafta oleinu ad ma'oid. Beyond the intensity of the actual description of the Churban that's described by the Navi, it's ad ma'oid, it reaches far further than that. And we, in fact, in the present, can't even know what that ma'oid will reach. Ad ma'oid. And that's where the Megillah ends. And we add, Hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, in order, like Rashi says, not to be Messiah with the Dover Shal Teichacha. And the obvious question is, why does the Megillah end that way? Let the Megillah end with that pasuk, Hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. Why was that preceded by the tzara? And we understand that there's two profound limudim, two profound understandings that the Novi is teaching us by arranging the psukim in that way. The first is that before we contemplate any tzara that we're experiencing, before we feel and internalize the present reality of Kotzafta Oleinu Ad Ma'oid, we precede that by first thinking about Hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. There's tzpiyah liyeshua. The tzara, even though it appears to be ad ma'oid, is actually finite. There is a kate. There are two systems of kates, as we know, be'itoy and ba'achishena and so on. But it's not without a kate. So, before being misboinen in the kotzafta oleinu ad ma'oid, we precede any introspection about sorrow we're experiencing with a profound understanding of Hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. Sorrow, as profound, as difficult, as anguished as it might be, has, before it began, been determined its purpose, its extent, and its limitations. And then there's another profound lesson that the Navi is giving us. We will have to struggle on our own sometimes while experienced tzara to believe in Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'Neshuva. The Navi ends his words with Ki emois ma'astanu kotzafto aleinu ad ma'od. There are times when Klal Yisrael collectively or a Yid individually may feel, like Rashi says so powerfully, B'shvil shechotanu, although we were chayte, lo hoya l'cha laharba is ketzef. It can't be Rebbeinu Shalom, the what I did deserves what I'm experiencing. Can't be. And we want to hear the words of the Navi again, Hashivenu. But the Navi doesn't give us those words. Because now it's our chizuk and our emunah, which we have to generate internally, to reinvigorate ourselves in that place of darkness, in that place of confusion, in that place where we can feel hopeless, to then ourselves say, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'Neshuva. Two limudim that we see from the sequencing of the psukim. Every tzara is preceded by a purpose, a reason, a rationale. There's the ultimate goal of Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'Neshuva. Because ein puronus ba'al ha'olam ela b'shvil Yisrael. There's a cosmic purpose in everything, in every detail, in every part. And there are times when we'll feel the depths of kotzafto aleinu ad ma'od, and that's where the Rebbeinu Shalom gives us the nisayon and the opportunity to generate our own declaration of Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'Neshuva, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. This is especially poignant in what the Gemara in the end of Masechta Sotah describes as ikvasa de Mashiach, where we understand that Chazal are describing the latter part of the panorama of history, in which the sugya in the end of Masechta Sotah says, Ein lonu lihishoen elo alovinu shebashamayim. Klal Yisrael will be bereft of the usual insight and clarity and resource that allows Klal Yisrael to be able to relate to Ritzoni Yisbarach. We'll be missing Eretz Yisrael, Mikdash, Sanhedrin, Melech, Novi. All the key treasures that Klal Yisrael has. And Ein Lonu Lishoen Ela B'nei Shemayim doesn't mean that in absence of all of those, we'll be left with just that. It means the purpose of Ikvasa the Mashiach is to bring us to the point where each one of us will, in ourselves, will then be able, through the tzara, through the lack of clarity, through the confusion, through the distance, to be able to declare that it's a reality to us that there is nothing but Avinu Shebashamayim. The avodah of the doros of Ikvasa the Mashiach is to discover Ein Lonu Lishoen El Avinu Shebashamayim. Megillas Eicha begins, and as we said, we'll use Nechama and how the Navi wants us to in this Nachem to then expand into a general discussion of trying to gain a appreciation of Drochav Yisbarach. The second pasuk in Megillas Eicha, Bochoi sivke balayla v'dimosa alechyo Ein lo Menachem mikol hayaveh. The Navi declares Klal Yisrael as being in a state of Ein lo Menachem. Klal Yisrael has no nechama. The Chidah, in his Pirush on Tanakh, Chaimas Anach, so the Chidah brings in the name of the grandson of the Karban Aaron, the Mefarish of the Teres Kayanim. And he describes the grandson of the Karban Aaron. He says, Harav Hamuvok, Nechtoi shal Harav Karban Aaron miraboni Izmir. one of the Rabbanim of Izmir, the grandson of the Karban. And he says, this description that the Navi says of Ein Lo Menachem gives us a key to understand the sequence of the psukim in the end of the Haftarah of Parshas Eikev. The sequence of the psukim are difficult to understand. You're familiar, it's Haftarah from 2 weeks ago. And these Haftarahs, Rabbi say, are the source of Klal Yisrael's clarity in Golus. We know that from a halacha that would have applied in some years to the Haftarah of this past week of Parshas Re'eh, that the Haftarah of Shiva de Nechemto displaces the Haftarah of Machar Chodesh. The importance of maintaining the sequence of the Shiva de Nechemto is central to the Avodah of this period. And the psukim read like this: Shimu Elai Roidfei Tzedek Mevakshe Hashem. The Navi is speaking to those who are Mevakesh Hashem, those who want to find Kiviyochol Hashgachasi Yisbarach in the Hastara of Golus. And the Navi gives them an instruction: Habitu el tzur chutzavtem. Look at the rock that, so to speak, you were hammered out from. Vel makeves bur nukartem. Who are those? Habitu el Avram avichem vel Sarah techilelchem. Look at the Avos, Avram and Sarah. And then the familiar pasuk the Haftarah ends with Ki nicham Hashem tzion, nicham kol charveiseah, bayosim midbar ke'eden, etc. The obvious question is how do these psukim flow? The Mevakshe Hashem who are seeking to see the Hashgachasi Yisbarach and the Hastara of Golus. So they're told to look at the Avos, and then Ki nicham Hashem tzion, a vision of the Gula Hasidah. How are these psukim connected? So there is a sifri in Parshas Ha'azinu on the pasuk of Tsur Yolod Choteshi, which means that Klal Yisrael forgot Tsur Yolodcha, the rock from which you were born. Teshi is Miloshin Shikha. And the Sifri says that Klal Yisrael forgets that what maintains them in Golus is Bris Avos. And the Sifri quotes these psukim, Shimu Elai Roidfei Tzedek Habitu. So it seems that the Sifri understands that the psukim are reminding Klal Yisrael what is their source of kiyum and their schus in Golus. The Chidah, like we said, says a davar nifla. He says we find in a number of dinim that Chazal interpret the word ein in the sense of ayin. By Yerusha, ben ein loi ayin olav. If there isn't literally a son, investigate further to see if there's other offspring. So to by yibum, there are times in which the word ein can be read and understood as ayin. So the Chidah asks, where's the source of this interpretation that Chazal say that the word ein can be understood as ayin? So he says this. About Sarah Imenu it says, familiar pasuk, Vatihi Sarah Akara ein lo vlad. Sarah was an Akara and was unable to have a child, but she did. Which means even though what it looked like was ein, but a deeper understanding of the Hashgach of the Rebbeinu Shalom, a deeper understanding of what is possible with a more profound grasp of the reality, leads us to see the aim of all of Klal Yisrael. So ein loi can be substituted as read as ayin. Look further and see that there's something far deeper here, and what appears to be ein is really ayin. The makor for that is a pasuk by Sarah. Zok the Chidah. Megillas Eicha begins with the Navi describing Klal Yisrael as ein lo menachem. Says the Navi, it's never really ein lo menachem, because habitu. Look at the shirish of Klal Yisrael, Avram and Sarah who are akurim. Ein loy just means that's what it appears to be, but in reality, ayin olav. There's something much more profound that the eye can't immediately see. And therefore, says the Navi, a situation of desperation and hopelessness now becomes Ki nicham Hashem tzia nicham kol charvei Nifla. Shimu elai roid fei tzedek mevakshe Hashem. We're looking to find Havaya, Midas Arachamim, in the Hastorah, and the intense Midas Adin of Golus. Where do we have the ability, where does Klal Yisrael and every individual get the ability to roll back, to peel back Hastorah, and see below what looks like an absolutely ain, to see just the opposite? Habitu, says the Novi, al tzur chutzavtem v'makeres bu nukartem habitu al Avrom avichu avichem v'nsor techilalchem. Because that all of Klal Yisrael came from something which was an ain, but became the sherish of all of the dairies. Ain can be substituted to ayin. Look deeper. Be maimed that there's a more profound hashgacha that we may not be able to immediately see. Because in a situation of impossibility, there could exist the sherish of the whole of Klal Yisrael. Says the Novi, therefore, when we end Megillas Eicha with a sense of Ein Lo Menachem, the response is Ayin Olov. Let's look deeper. Shimu elai roid fei tzedek mevakshe Hashem. We can find the underpinnings of Rachamim, of Geula, of Yeshua in the Hastara. And therefore we can then be maimin again, Ki nicham Hashem tzia nicham kol charvei. The Gemara in Masechta Chagiga discusses the psukim of a mistarim tivkei nafshi mipnei geva, that kiviyochol the Rebbeinu Shalom is boiche b'mistarim for gavosam shel Yisrael shenitno mehem v'nitla le'uma sa'ilam. And the Gemara has a discussion. Where does that bechiyah kiviyachol of the Rebbeinu Shalom take place? Gemara obviously is describing in Yonim Nisgovim, but the Gemara's lashon is in the girsa that Rashi has that there is bechiyah in bote gavoy, in the inner chambers, and in bote baroi there isn't bechiyah. Rabbeinu Chananel and many Kadmoinim have the exact opposite girsa in the Gemara. That there's never bechiyah in bote gavoy, but there can be bechiyah in bote baroi. And many Kadmoinim explain that this is the ikke girsa of the Gemara, that bote gavoy does not have bechiyah. And even in Shittas Rashi, the Ramak in Sefer HaPardis, or Moshe Cordovera in Sefer HaPardis, explains that fundamentally even Rashi agrees that in bote gavoy there isn't bechiyah. Rashi is referring to malochim in bote gavoy. These are of course in yonim nisgovim, but the sense that we understand from that is that in bote gavoy there isn't bechiyah. It's bote baroi only. That's subject to kiviyachol, a midah of bechiyah. Let's first define the concept of bechi as a description of kiviyachol the anhag of the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Maral writes in a number of places that the word bechi is closely associated with the word novoich. When a person is boiche, what happens is that the eyes are most directly affected by the person being in a state of bechi. One example is that the eyes fill with tears. And says the Maral, because the impact of bechi is to occlude the vision of a person. It doesn't allow the person to see clearly. And that's why bechi and novoich are so closely associated in their sheirish. Because what brings a person to bechi is the despair that they can't see a way forward. They're novoich, like nevoichim heim ba'oretz, sogar aleim hamidbar. They're in a situation where they see no way out from the tzara that they're in. Tzara miloshin meitzar. They're constricted, they're trapped. And if they can see no way of forward, then that brings a person to a state of Bechi. And Bechi brings a person to Mevucha. Says the Gra, that's why Bechi is accompanied by Dema. Because when the eye fills with tears, the eye then loses its clarity of vision. The vision gets occluded at that point. Bechi means the ability to see a way forward. The despair that can envelop a person when he feels, I'm in a sorrow which doesn't seem to have a way to be able to proceed from. Kiviyochel, when we describe that there is Bechia, but mistorim tivke nafshi, it means the Rabbeinu Shalom places us in a situation where we don't see how. The Hanhaga of the Rabbeinu Shalom is showing us that there's a way forward. When Mikdash was Chorev, Klal Yisrael didn't see anymore how Klal Yisrael would then continue. Nofla loy tuchal kum besulas bas Yehuda. The reason why Evel loy aleichem is accomplished by Bechi is because the absolute finality of someone being nistalik min ha'olam is the most intense experience of something which is absolutely unremediated by something that we can do. And that's why the intensity of Evel is accompanied with Bechi. But Mistorim Tivke Nafshi means Kiviyochel, the Rebbeinu Shalom's Hashgacha, appears to us as though we are in a state of Churban which has no way forward. But of course, that's only in Bote Baroi, says the Ramak. And the Leshem quotes that this is already in the Radvaz and in the Girs of Rabbeinu Chananel in the Gemara. It's only in Bote Baroi. It's only in how things appear on the surface. But in Bote Gavoi, in terms of what we understand is the profound rotzen of the Rabbeinu Shalom, we're maimin that, of course, there's direction. And of course, there's Geula. And of course, we're being mitzapeh. Mitzapeh miloshen tzpiyah. We want to be able to see the sechazena inenu. We want our vision back. Because Bechi includes it, and we want our vision back. The sechazena, that's why Geula and Re'iyah are so often associated. Tzipisa lishua, zoicha beroye. Because the depth of the tzara of Golus is the hanhaga of what seems to be Bechi, where the vision is occluded. Novich, like the Maral says. Eyes filled with dema that doesn't allow us to see clearly forward. But just to give us perhaps some further understanding in what Bote Gavoi represents. To relate a Dovar Nifla, that it says in the Sefer Ner Yisrael from the Kozhnitzer Magid. This is a pirush that the Kozhnitzer Magid wrote on Tshuvas HaGeonim, and in Zagdoma to his pirush, he writes the following. He says, when we, as Klal Yisrael or as individuals, undergo Yisurim, we undergo Nisayim, we undergo and experience a hastara of Chasad of Yisbarach. And as Rashi says, Ki mois mastanu kotzafta, we understand that the Rabbeinu Shalom's Hanhaga is commensurate to Ritzoni Yisbarach kifi maseh b'nei Adam. So he says we could have thought that means that the Hanhaga of the Rabbeinu Shalom that Kiviyochel limits the Gili of Hanhaga was sort of an aberration, a corruption, a change from what Kiviyochel Ritzoni Yisbarach was. And here the Kozhnitzer Magid says the following lashon. He says, "Ulefi emunosenu." He says, "We are maimin shehakoil hoyo b'ritzoynoi haposhut." That there isn't a detail of the Hanhaga of the Rebbeinu Shalom, even though it may appear to us as a hastara, that wasn't part of the Kiviyachol, the Rotzen of the Rabbeinu Shalom, at the very foundation of the Bria. Ve'ein kol chodosh tachas hashemesh. And he says, where's the proof? He says, Ksiv ha'oretz hoisosoyhu vavoyu. The psukim that describe the beginning of Maaseh Bereshis, Chazal say ha'oretz hoisosoyhu vavoyu, are remozim to the four galuyos. V'choshech al pnei Soim is Yavon. Al pnei Soim is, like we mentioned, Golus Edom, which is a Tehoim, which seems to be limitless. V'im kol zeh, and despite the fact that all of that existed within Ritzoni Yisbarach, Somach bebrias ha'olam. Every yom ends with the words Ki Tov, Ki Tov. Somach bebrias ha'olam. He says, and that's how we understand what we say in the Musaf of Yom Tovim. We ask that the Rebbeinu Shalom should bring us back Liyushalayim Beis Mikdoshcha B'simchas Olam. What does the word Simchas Olam mean? Rebbeinu Shalom Yushalayim Beis Mikdoshcha B'simchas Olam. So ordinarily we understand B'simchas Olam means a simcha which will then never end. But it's based on a pasuk in Novi which says that when Klal Yisrael will be oile, it will be v'simchas oilam al rosham, which doesn't refer to what Klal Yisrael will experience or what Klal Yisrael will experience at the moment of Geula. So simchas oilam is a description of something, not a prediction of what will be limitlessly la'osid, but a prediction of the state of completion of the Bria. So the Koshnitzer Maggid explains it this way. He says, Kiloimar, Hagam sha'onu begolus u'b'merirus leiv. He says, Klal Yisrael in Golus, and we experience in events, we experience happenings in our lives that cause us merirus leiv, that are bitter, are difficult, are challenging. He says, Halo HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'simchas oilamai rozeh v'samach. In the same way as in the span of Klal Yisrael's history, the Galuyos were part of the Rebbeinu Shalom's original Ratzon. There's something so profound that in the moment we don't grasp, but when the Rebbeinu Shalom Kiviyachol set in motion the entire history of the Bria, there was nothing but simcha. Lashon of the Gemara Megillah Shaisa Simcha Kiyom Shenivru Shamayim V'aretz. Frek the Magid Kiyom Shenivru B'Shamayim V'aretz contains in it Ha'aretz Isasoyu Vavoyu Choshech Al Pnei Soim. The agony of the endless Golus. But all of that was in part of HaKadosh Somach Kiyom Shenivru B'Shamayim V'aretz. Simchas Olam HaRosham means the ability to appreciate and experience how everything that we endured was actually, truly Simcha. How everything that we endured was part of Simchas Olam. Simchas Olam HaRosham is the elation, says the Magid, of those coming out of Golus realizing that it was in the moment that it appeared to be a time, that it appeared to be Choshech, that it appeared to be Soyu Vavoyu. But in reality, the Simchas Olam HaRosham, there was purpose, there was a profound accomplishment in all of it, in every detail of it. And that's something which we'll experience last Lavoi. What the Briskirov in his Chumash Sefer, and towards the end of the Sefer, brings in the name of his father Reb Chaim, that what we will be zoiche to at the point of Geula is what he calls Soif Kol HaCheshbonos, in which all the circles will close, where every journey will be shown to be complete. It's in the moment that we see what the Koshnitzer Maggid describes as Begolus B'miras Leiv. He says, Halo HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'simchas olamai ro'ozeh v'samach. And then he says the following. Ve'ein shikcho tmura lefonov. It's not as though the Rebbeinu Shalom's plan was subverted and something else was substituted in its place. It's not as though our deiris are deiris a failure, that it should have been something else, and this is what Kiviyachol the Rebbeinu Shalom has to accept. Chas v'shalom. Ein shikcho tmura lefanov, v'hakol b'ritzoynei haposhut. Although it's bewildering to us, how could it be? Because seemingly ki mois mastonu kotzafta aleinu. It seems to have been done because of our ma'asim, because of chet, but in reality, on a profound level, it's all Ritzoynei Yisbarach. How do we understand that? We can't. The Arizal writes in the end of his Sefer Arba Mea Shekel Kesef. He says when the Rambam classically gives us an understanding of how Kiviyochol, the knowledge of the Rebbeinu Shalom Yediyah, and the free will of the person, namely Bechira, can be consistent. Because as the Rambam asks, the Rebbeinu Shalom's Yediyah has to be absolute and infallible, and therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom must by definition know Kiviyachal what will be, and therefore the Bechira can't subvert that. And the Rambam says, that question is because the Yediyah of the Rebbeinu Shalom and our Yediyah are not the same thing. Zot the Arizal, in reality, that same question of how there could exist Yediyah and Bechira is also the question of how Ritzoynei Yisbarach and Chet can coexist. Because Chet seems to be to us something that subverts the Rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom. But everything is B'Ritzoynei Yisbarach. So how is it consistent? If there's no Shikcho Tmura, how is it consistent? The answer is we can't understand that. When the Olamos became limited and our minds became, kafir the way it was Ritzoynei Yisbarach to create us, that we can only grasp something finite according to the dimensions of the Olam Asiyah in which we live, so we have this inconsistency. But Kapov Yisbarach says the Rambam, Yediyah and Bechira are consistent. Says Arizal, so Chet and Yediyah is consistent. How? We don't know. But Simchas Olam HaRosham, Ein shikcha ve'ein tmura. It's all part of Ritzoynei Yisbarach. Every aspect of Golus, Mirira, slave, everything that's included in Chas v'Sholom, Mois, Mastano, and Kotzafta. The depth of Tzipiyah Yeshua is to merit v'Simchas Olam HaRosham. To see how the Kitoiv and Somach Kiyom Shenivru Ba'aretz could include at the same time Ba'aretz Eisasoyu V'Avoyu V'Choshech Al Pnei Sohim. How is that? We can't understand it. But there's other dimensions of the Bria, says the Arizal, that our minds have to somehow make consistent and our logic fails us. So Arizal says it's the same thing here. Somehow in the Seder of the Ishtalshalos of the Ilomos, these two things can exist, and yet in our dimension we can't understand it. He says, "U'k'moisha asimcha oz bohem l'sham zot the magid yovi oisonu k'shia rotzen l'goleinu." What we're looking forward is simchas olam ha'rosham. But what maintains us in the present is that knowledge that even if we can't discern it, and even if we can't understand it, and certainly even if we can't feel it, but it's absolutely the Metzias. There's the V'simchas Olam HaRosham. It's been anticipated, it's been exactly determined, and its purpose is part of what Reb Chaim describes as Soif Kol HaCheshbonos. There's a plan, there's a mosaic, there's a panorama of Yemois Olam. And we, in our narrow perspective, see one part of it. But it was all Kayim Itchilas Abriya. He says, "V'dabeni shekol ma she'over aleinu b'goluseinu hamar hakol b'ritzoynei haposhut b'li shum shinui k'mo shene'emar b'chol eis tzor v'tzuko ein lanu melech ela ota v'tzrichem lekabulei b'simcha." And that allows us to understand that what we're experiencing is so much bigger than ourselves. Very often we feel that we can be ma'ayin and understand the klolim of bitochen, we can learn shar bitochen and other inyonim that give us clarity in droch of Yisbarach. We can be misboinen and understand profoundly inyonim of emunah. But then at some point it fails us. And the reason why it fails us is because we think That's all if a person is roi. But if chas v'sholom, what we've done, all of that doesn't apply. That's where the limud and the iyun in bitochen and darchei Hashem sometimes we feel fails us. Because we think that yes, all of it would have been ritzoni yisbarach, but chas v'sholom, like in the words of Yoina Hanovi, ki nigrashti miponecha. Rabbeinu Shalom, I've come to the point when nigrashti, I've been dismissed. I've been pushed away. And therefore we feel somehow what's happening to us can't be Ritzoni Yisbarach. Can't be. And here we have the profundity of the Yesod of the Arizal. If something can exist, it must be Ritzoni Yisbarach. Because nothing can exist if it isn't Rabbeinu Shalom's Ratzon. Gam ki elech begeitz al moves lo iro roki ato imodi. Reb Tzadok HaKohen explains that doesn't mean lo iro roki ato imodi, means eventually Rabbeinu Shalom, you'll help me out of the gates al moves. It means lo iro roki ato imodi means because ultimately there can be no ra. Because Rabbeinu Shalom, if I am here, it means it's Ritzoynai that I should be here. And therefore this now allows me to forge a new path in Avodah from the gates al-Moves. Gam ki elech begates al-Moves lo yira ki ato imodi. How does that make sense? But didn't I come here through Chet Chas v'Shalom? Says Arizal, yes, that's the same question as Yediyah and Bechira. How on the one hand these two things can be consistent, we don't know. But nothing can exist if it isn't Ritzoni Yisbarach. And therefore, Gam ki elech begates al moves lo iro ki ate modi means because even a person may think he's in a state of nefila, and ki nigrashti miponecha, there isn't such a reality. There's only one reality, which means then the Rebbeinu Shalom is allowing that place to become a new path of avodah. Gam ki elech begates al moves lo iro ki ate imodi. We're familiar with the Sha'ar Tzion in Hilchas Avedis, in Hilchas Yom Kippurim, where the Sha'ar Tzion says that the reason why we lay in the Haftarah of Yoina on Yom Kippur is because a person can think, like Yoina Hanovi thought, that I can be Beireach mipnei Hashem. I've reached a point in which kinigrashti miponecha, and I'm no longer subject to the rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And the answer is that the Rebbeinu Shalom continuously generates paths for a person's avodah. Ad kedei kach that the Rebbeinu Shalom will be matil you layom and send the dag to find you and bring you back to your shlichus. Al yavtichecha yoytzrecha, says the Sha'ar Tzion, that the Beis Shoel is monoislach. There isn't a way that a person chas v'sholom removes himself from hashgachasa yisbarach. Gam ki elech begeitz al moves lo yiro ki ate imodi. Even if a person feels chas v'sholom that I'm subject to ra, ki ato imodi. Is that possible? Seemingly that's a tmura, it's keneged ritzaynoi. That's part of the soid of a simchas olam harosham. It says the Koshnitz Magid, this is what the Gemara means, that in boti gavoi there's no b'chi. Because even though it may appear externally as though chas v'sholom something has been subverted, as though we can't see how while being hoilech begates al moves, that there can be a way forward. We're in a situation of bechia and mevucha. Beboti gavoy ein bechia. Because the pnimius hadvarim, as profound and as abstract as that might seem, kol kuloi is ritzoni yisbarach. We're on the threshold of Chodesh Elul. Just this past Shabbos, as we saw Salanta describes it in his Igeres, we heard the Koil HaKoire Chodesh Elul, which is generally understood to refer to the Shliach Tzibur that says, Rosh Chodesh Elul Yeh, as Yisrael famously writes, Milo Yechazenu Palotzus, who isn't moved, who isn't shaken, when hearing the Koil HaKoirei Kodesh Elul. But it's remarkable that in the Seder of the Haftarah, which we've been basing our Divrei Torah on, the sequence, as is established by the Goinim, is Tlosa de Parnasa, there's Shiva de Nechemta, and then there's Tarti of Tiyuvta, the two Haftarahs of Tshuva. So the period of the Arboim Achroinim Baratzen, the period of Elul, overlaps with the final Haftarahs of Nechama. We would have assumed that once we enter into Chodesh Elul, we begin the preparation of the Arboim Yom towards the final Ritzi of Yom Kippurim. Haftarahs would then shift to reflect that, but it's not that way. The Tarti, the Tiyuvta, will begin later, in Shuvah Yisrael and so on. But now through Chodesh Elul, we're accompanied still by Parashias of Nechama. And perhaps one reason for this is because in order for us to approach the Yom HaNoraim, whose essence is Gilui Malchusa Yisbarach, Imru lefonai Malchias Kadesha Tamlichuni Aleichem, Ubameh B'Shoifar, the essence of the Yom of Zeh HaYom Tchilas Ma'asecha, the Yom of being Mechadish, the Rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shem Kivyochel to be Melech Ba'ilamai. How do we see that? How do we exist in a world that has such profound hastara? The first avodah we need before envisioning the magnificence of Gilui Malchusai, the avodah that we need before we can speak about the Simloich Ata, the Kim Levadecha, is to be maimed that the hastara is Malchus. We're going to be making Shchinta Me'afra. It's not as though the Geula will emerge, the Geula on its own, as something that doesn't follow from the time of Golus. The Geula will emerge from Tzpir Yeshua. It will emerge from being misboinen that now we are in the Hanhaga Nisteres of Bote Gavoi. And so we want to approach the Yemei Rachman Barotzain. The avodah that accompanies us is first let's kiviyochel discover the oimek of the Hanhaga Nisteres of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And then we can speak about its final magnificent Gilui. The Haftarahs of the Shiva de Nechemta accompany us through the avodah of El. Because to speak about the Simloich Ata Hashem Levadecha, to speak about Gilui Malchusai, we understand that the path to Gilui Malchusai, the means through which Gilui Malchusai is going to come, the way of that is from the Hanhaga Nisteres. This is all part of Zechariah Meis Olam, Binu Shneis Dair Vadair. It's all part of the Mahalach of Gilui Ritzainai. Even though, as the Leshem asks so powerfully in Sefer Hadeya, doesn't it look like the Deiros HaHolchim and Mismatim and the opposite is happening? Don't we understand that the Deiros are becoming more choshuch, more limited? It's all part of the Korei Deiros Miresh. But to be inspired with the Kabbalah's Malchus de La'asid Lavoi, we understand that that's coming mitoich the Seder of the Anhag of the Galuyas presently. But let's go a step further. For a person to be able to be Mekabel Oil Malchusai on himself, over in the fun of Kibnei Morain, Echad, the reality of a person being a Metzius, as Rabbi Yonah says, a Tzir Nemon for Avodah Yisbarach, means a person understanding that there is no reality even for himself but Tzoni Yisbarach. And for a person to be able to see that and live it requires a person to be misboinen, that despite hastara, despite a world that seems to be an oilam of mikre, as the Ramban says, the familiar Lashon Ramban in the end of Parshas Bayis, the avodah of being mavchin and hashgashi is barach through the depth of hastara. What we began with from the Chidah, ein merely means ayin. Ein just means on one level it can't be seen, but at its most profound it can be discerned. Ayin olav. And that ability for a person to see and live that there is nothing but Ritzoni Yisbarach requires the ability for a person not to be overwhelmed, as though their chas v'sholom would be shikcha u'tmura lefanov, and to understand that nothing, even in the depths of the tahoim of the golus, exists but for Ritzoni Yisbarach. If we internalize that and understand it, that we can begin to approach what Malchus is. Malchus goes far beyond just being Mekayim Ritzonoi and Chas v'Sholom not being Oivar Ritzonoi. It's as Rabbi Yonah is Magdir, seeing ourselves as a Tzir Ne'emon, where nothing exists but Ritzoni Yisbarach, and in reality, it's a Mishnah Mefureshes. Asei Ritzoin Cha Ki Ritzonoi. The Chovos HaLevavos brings that in Shara B'tochen to explain that the way a person is zoicha to the hashgacha that B'tochen defines and quantifies begins by a person being boiteach. He begins Shara B'tochen with ke'eved al adoinov. The same way as an odoin, a master has to provide his eved with the means to carry out his mission. So too, says the Chovos HaLevavos, ultimately B'tochen is our understanding that the Rebbeinu Shem provides for us commensurate to us seeing ourselves as Avdei Hashem. And the Lashon that is quoted very often by many Svarim based on the Zohar Kodesh, Avdo leslo migarmo klum. The definition of an Eved is that no self exists but Ritzoni Yisbarach. And as the Sasemis repeats in so many places, particularly in Sefer Bereshis, the greatest way in which a person accomplishes the hashlama of himself and becomes his etzem is al yidei being misbatel Ritzoni Yisbarach. That, says the Sasemis, is one of the ploim of Avodas Hashem. That through a person being mevatel Ritzonoi, adarabah, he finds himself. But how do we have the ability to live that metzius that there is nothing but Ritzoni Yisbarach? So we first need the limud of nechama. We need the limud to understand that it can look like ein menachem, but in reality, ki nicham Hashem tzion, because there's an additional havchana which is called ayin olav, which, as we said, is learnt from Sarah ein lo vlad. Ayin olav. Conclude with the Dover Pele that said b'shem the Balatanya, the pasuk in Tehillim, kein bakodesh chazisicha lirois uzcha uchveidecha. The Balatanya teaches that pasuk means kein bakodesh chazisicha means halavai, when eventually we'll be zoichet to kodesh again. The histoikakus and the feeling of closeness and the yearning for the Rebbeinu Shalom should approach what there was when we were be'eretz tzio b'li mayim. Golus is an opportunity to be misboinen and gain kurva. These yomim of yomim nechemta yomim which we glean from the hastorah, the oimek of Rachma Yisbarach. And halavai came back kodesh chazisicha liros uzcha chodecha. The bikush, the ivisicha kivisicha me'eretz merchakim, which Slichus begins with Yom Beis. Kivisicha me'eretz merchakim. The rotzen to find Rebbeinu Shalom, to connect kiviyachol. That's the gift of Golus. To discover the oimek of Bote Gavoy in the Zman of Hastorah. And halavai came back kodesh chazisicha. I remember hearing from one of my Rebbeim And he was mechazik, a young man going through a tzara. And he said to him in Yiddish, he said, "Ich werd noch benken for die tefillah, for that tefillah." The tefillah that you're going to be mispal mitoch tzara, mitoch hastara, when in Mitz Hashem the Yeshua comes, you'll yearn for the kurva of that tefillah again. This is the gift of this time of Golus, the tshuka itself. And when Mevakish came back, koyedesh chazisicha, that when the menigal b'mheir b'yomeinu omen, the bikush should be that profound. An ace of tzara, an ace of nisayan. Gam ki elech begeit salmovis le'ira is to find the ki'ata imodi. And when we're maimin that there is that ki'ata imodi, an irrefutable and immutable fact, that there's nothing but Ritzoni Yisbarach, then Be'ezer Hashem we can approach the Yom HaNeiroim and be makabel al malchusay be'emes. Hey!
Shem Irgen Shir Torah. Mr. Boss would like to give a big yeshikayach to Rabbi Deutsch for the inspiring Josh. I'd like to give a big yeshikayach to Moshe Klein for sponsoring tonight's Shili Nishmas Imoy, Hisha Edel, Bas Rabbi Ever, Allah Sholom, Gertzeit Aleph Shchedish El. I'd like to give a big yeshikayach to Rabbi Levi Hachhauser, sponsoring tonight's Shili Nishmas, Meinu Harav Avram Yaakov, Ber Meir, Zatzal Pam, Gertzeit Chof Ches Ov, and Shili Nishmas Oviv, Rabbi Moshe Ber Levi, Allah Sholom Gertzeit also Chof Ches Ov, Tenish B'Seim Tzuris B'Tzara Chaim. Got the great chus of sponsoring a shir, but to put an ad in the dinner journal in honor of Ingen Shir Torah's annual dinner next Monday, and be mechazik our Botzas Torah throughout the year worldwide of Ingen Shir Torah, and honor any Rabbanim whose shirim you've enjoyed. And call 718-851-8651, email ist@yeshivanet.com. Yashikach Oram Hakamim Chananya Ben Akasha Emor Tzagadish Baruch Hu Zakes as Yisrael Figure Himmelum Tar Mitzvah Shenem Al Neu Chofes Amal Sidka Yagdol Ter V'Yader.
Misquar, Misarma, Misnasa, Misadar, Misala, Misalal, Shemain, Bajab, Lami Kalber, Khasal, Shiva.